right, good morning, everyone. Since we are live webcasting this, I think we can start right on time. I'm Shihoko Goto with the Wilson Center's Asia program. Thank you all so much for being here this morning. Before we begin, I should say that this event is being sponsored in conjunction with the Korea Center here at the Wilson Center as well. So thank you to the Korea Center for making this possible. We are here at a time when TPP is very much in the headlines, but that said, the outlook for the agreement remains murky. The political hurdles in the United States remain high, and there is much discussion about a possible vote during the lame duck session for TPP, but this isn't really the time or the place to have that discussion. I'm hoping instead today we can focus more broadly about the question of whether there can be an upward momentum in the U.S. debate about trade, and whether free trade and indeed globalization can cease becoming dirty words in the lexicon of U.S. politics. That kind of perception and analysis of trade is very different from how it is perceived in much of Asia, where free trade and market liberalization enjoy much broader public support. And TPP in particular is seen as a key component for economic growth, and also to jumpstart much needed domestic reform. That said, there are concerns about the consequences of free trade, and not least because there is great concern about stagnant wages, worrisome job prospects, growing income inequality, and in Asia, there is also concern about changing formulas that have worked in the past to ensure growth, such as the prevalence of state-owned enterprises and restricting foreign ownership. Our focus today will be on countries and regional blocs with governments that have expressed keen interest in joining the TPP, and I'm hoping that we will be able to discuss how the debate in these countries and blocs are evolving given the shifting realities of the debate about TPP, and also whether there are alternative visions or plan Bs apart from TPP in these areas. So for that, we have a really great lineup of speakers, and you have their bios in front of you, but in order of their speaking today will be Tammy Overby from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She is a senior vice president for Asia at the Chamber, and she is very much a celebrity in her own right in South Korea for being very much involved with the KORU's trade negotiations. Rupert Hammond Chambers is the president of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council, and he is also a managing director for Taiwan at the Bauer Group Asia. His resume is stunningly impressive, but you can have the details in front of you. And then last but certainly not least is Pek Kun Heng. She is the director of the ASEAN Studies Initiative and assistant professor at American University's School of International Service. And she really has been at the forefront of talking about ASEAN and the differences within the ASEAN bloc about free trade and its future. So with that, Tammy.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the Wilson Center for the kind invitation to be with you all here today. It really is an important time to be having this conversation about the future of trade in Asia. But before we can discuss expanding U.S. trade alliances in Asia, I think we need to discuss the elephant in the room. And that would be the overall deteriorating atmosphere about trade in the United States and around the world. All one needs to do is listen to the U.S. presidential campaign rhetoric about trade or contemplate the Brexit vote to get a sense of the deep dissatisfaction and, I would argue, misunderstanding about trade that exists around the world. It's important for those of us in the private sector government, and think tank communities to engage in this discussion in ways that really help deepen the understanding among the public and policymakers about the importance of trade. Moreover, I think we have to help avoid damaging our future by not allowing critics to misrepresent the causes of job loss or economic stagnation in our economy. So I see today as an opportunity for us to get the facts out. I work at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, so it should be a surprise to no one that I am a strong supporter of trade. I believe that trade is good for the United States, for our workers, our companies, our agriculture producers, and our economy overall. However, I do think we have to have a more honest conversation. There's no question that some industries, some communities, and some people have been hurt by trade. We at the Chamber are more mindful of this than ever, and we're actively exploring new ways to assist workers in transition as we continue to make the public case for trade. As a nation, America absolutely must do better in helping those hurt. But trade is not the sole, or I would argue even the main source of dislocation and job loss. There are many other factors: technology and innovation, the development of disruptive new technologies and business models, a changing work environment that requires different skill sets and more education. And we're hampered by tighter regulations, higher taxes that hinder growth and expansion. All of these are serious challenges, and the U.S. Chamber is at work on all of them. I should also note that regardless of how one feels about globalization, it's here, and it's not going away anytime soon. And if the U.S. should decide to look inward and build walls that prevent us from selling to 95% of the population that lives outside the borders of America, our trading partners will find other countries who will be willing to take our place. So we at the Chamber are keenly focused on doing everything we can to advance the U.S. trade agreements around the world, whether it's in the TISA, the Trading and Services Agreement, the EGA, the Environmental Goods Agreement, or TTIP, which is our US-EU FTA, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we're talking about today. The Chamber is actively leading in all those initiatives. We're also pushing hard to secure permanent funding for the Ex-Im Bank, another key tool in America's trade kit. The costs and the risks of not doing these things are high. Slower economic growth and job creation here, competitive disadvantage for U.S. products and services abroad, and the declining influence of America and our leadership everywhere. In short, if we do not continue to trade and engage with the world, America's future will be worse, not better. The world is not standing still. America can't afford to either, and we definitely can't afford to move backwards. Nowhere is this more important and critical than in Asia, still the most dynamic and competitive region in the global economy. And no trade agreement is more important for the United States or Asia than TPP. However, we don't want to put the cart before the horse. There's still a lot of work to do here and in the other countries before we can see the benefits of TPP. We're seeing encouraging signs from our other TPP partners about their ratification procedures and prospects. A number of those countries are on track to ratify this year or early next year. Here in the U.S., the Chamber, along with my good friend Dave Salmonson back there with the the Farm Bureau, ECAT, NAM, the National Association of Manufacturing, and the Business Roundtable, we are leading this TPP coalition. And we are working very hard to get it done this year in lame duck. And I know you've seen some premature notices about the death of TPP, but I'm here to tell you that the administration and Congress are working very hard on those outstanding issues, and the number of procedural requirements needed to be done under Trade Promotion Authority. The reasons that we support TPP are very clear. TPP is the most advanced, highest standard trade agreement ever negotiated. It would do more to advance U.S. economic and geostrategic interests in Asia than any single thing our country could do for the foreseeable future. Failing to take this step would have significant and lasting downside effects for America. First, what will TPP do? It's going to reduce and eliminate thousands, 18,000 remaining tariffs on U.S. industrial and agriculture goods. Second, the TPP goes farther than any agreement in history in addressing non-tariff barriers, behind the border challenges. These are that thicket of rules, regulation, standards, and other measures that make it more difficult and sometimes impossible and costly to export into some markets. Third, the TPP will establish new rules and disciplines in areas critical for all American businesses in the 21st century. These include groundbreaking measures in digital trade, the cloud, intellectual property protection, and new disciplines for competition with state-owned enterprises. So in our view, TPP is the best template for trade agreements in the 21st century. It's the best combination of provisions that address both traditional trade barriers, such as tariffs, and the more pernicious non-tariff barriers, and sets clear rules for the emerging areas, new areas like digital economy. This is why the Chamber is so committed to working with Congress and the administration and other stakeholders to bring this to a successful conclusion. This is why we want to see TPP enter into force and other countries join on. The TPP will set the high standards and the strong rules needed for fair competition in the 21st century. It is fair to say that Korea missed an opportunity to be part of the original TPP agreement. The TPP contains many provisions that are also found in the KORUS agreement, the U.S.-Korea FTA. But TPP goes beyond KORUS in a number of key areas. But I don't think that was the reason that the Korean government passed when they were urged to join in 2013. I think it had to do with FTA fatigue. South Korea had just completed the U.S.-Korea FTA, and they had just completed a similarly high standard FTA with Europe. So they were suffering from FTA fatigue. Also, Korea had and was pursuing FTAs with most of the countries already in TPP. So there was a sense in Korea that they really didn't need or have the bandwidth to do TPP at that time. Well, we are now at a point where the agreement is completed in October. 12 countries signed this agreement. And so new countries have to queue up. They have to self-select if they're interested in joining. But it's going to take a little bit of time. First, all 12 have to ratify. Then one of the requirements of Trade Promotion Authority is the president will have to certify that our 11 TPP partners have made all the changes and honored the commitments that they agreed to. And for some countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, these are transformative agreements. They're going to have to change, and they're in the process of changing a lot of laws and a lot of regulations to come into compliance with TPP. So if Korea is interested, they're going to have to, like other countries in the region, demonstrate a willingness and a commitment to meet the comprehensive and high standards of TPP. And I should note that most of the high standards and the rules that were promulgated in TPP were proposed by the United States. I was talking with Barbara Wiesel, our chief negotiator for TPP, earlier in the week, and she estimates that 80 to 90% of the rules and the standards in TPP were U.S. proposed. Now, did we get everything we wanted? No, it's a negotiation. No one ever gets everything they want in a negotiation. But we got the majority of what the U.S. asked for. And what that is leveling the playing field for our companies in Asia. So the fact that the second tranche isn't going to open right away, it's fine. That's okay. That's going to give countries like Korea time to address some issues that have come up in Korea's case with regards to implementation of KORUS and the general business environment in Korea. It will give Korea more time to meet the new standards in areas that aren't covered in KORUS, such as the robust chapter on digital trade or state-owned enterprise provisions, or in areas of IP protection where TPP is higher. Korea also has to deal with its own internal challenges and pressures that are fostering a more negative business environment for both foreign and domestic companies in Korea. All governments face pressure to throw up protectionist barriers when domestic growth slows. And the challenge is to resist those calls for new protectionism or falling back into old habits. Korea has so many positive assets and so much to offer companies in Asia, but it does seem like some steps have been taken back as growth has slowed. The KORUS agreement has led to increases in some U.S. goods exported to Korea in areas where the tariffs were lowered immediately. That's good news. But we are hearing more about new Korea-unique regulations, standards, and other measures that, while not necessarily KORUS-related, are nevertheless making it more difficult, more costly, and more unpredictable for U.S. companies doing business in Korea. So for Korea to join TPP, it will need to fully embrace the spirit of the agreement and be committed to ensuring that the terms are met without the constant need for pressure to do so. Just as Korea prospers from its exports to the United States and other markets, it will prosper from having more imports, foreign investment, and more involvement in Korea by companies that will provide jobs, technology, and new business models, and a sense of dynamism in an economy that is growing more slowly now. So TPP can provide that boost for Korea if Korea is prepared to take it. And I have a little bit of advice for other countries that are considering TPP. Countries like Taiwan, or economies like Taiwan, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, just to name a few. My advice to them is to pick a couple of long-standing, politically difficult issues and resolve them now. Show that you are willing and able to do politically difficult things. Start building domestic political support now for the challenging changes that will be required to meet the comprehensive rules and standards of TPP. Start building political support among your stakeholders in other countries, in the U.S. and the other 11 TPP founding countries, which you will need when it's time to apply for membership. And begin with consulting with the other TPP partners and the U.S. right now. I believe that when the U.S. ratifies TPP this year and joins our 11 founding TPP members as we move towards entry into force, it's going to be a huge pivotal moment for Asia and the world as other countries scramble to do the hard things that would be required to join or risk being disadvantaged. FTAs, by their very nature, are preferential agreements. Only the parties to the agreement benefit. And the 12 countries are committed to creating this comprehensive new high-standard agreement and addressing 21st century issues like the cloud, state-owned enterprises. And there's even a chapter designated to facilitate sharing of information among SMEs within the 12 TPP countries. I believe TPP is going to fundamentally change the landscape for trade across Asia, and that potential investors will gravitate towards TPP countries because it'll have a higher standard, it'll be a more predictable business environment, and more likely that rule of law will be followed. So I believe countries will either be on pathways to joining TPP or they're going to be left behind. And that 20 years from now, when we look back and look at who are members of TPP, we're going to see that the majority of Asian economies will be in TPP. and that TPP will have been the game changer that will continue to lift millions and millions of people across Asia out of poverty. And it will be responsible for underpinning economic growth, security, and prosperity across Asia for the 21st century. Thanks, and at an appropriate time, I look forward to your comments.
Right. Rupert.
Thank you very much indeed for this opportunity. And Tammy, you're amongst friends. Do feel free to refer to Taiwan as a country. So I have the privilege of, first and foremost, thanking the Wilson Center for this opportunity, both personally as well as an opportunity to talk on a more parochial subject as it relates to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that's the possibility that Taiwan, in the second round, would be accepted as a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is qualified in respect to the criteria, as we understand it now, for economies that could be accepted into the TPP. So Taiwan has the opportunity. Will it happen? The question I've been asking myself a lot recently seems a somewhat obvious one, and Taiwan's certainly been in business for a long, but is Taiwan open for business? I've really been quite curious about that of late. Is Taiwan open for business? Because I think you can go in both directions on this. Yes, it's open for business. Taiwan's one of the leading exporters globally. The supply chain, the technology supply chain, the global technology supply chain actually runs right through Taiwan and into China. So Taiwan is certainly open to business when we think about the products that we use for improving productivity in our own personal lives. But also Taiwan is not open for business. There are myriad areas of Taiwan's domestic economy that remain closed, or where you have barriers, admitted or not, that restrict the ability of companies outside of Taiwan to compete with Taiwan businesses and improve the quality of products and services offered to Taiwan citizens. And that's a real issue. It's an issue for Taiwan because it creates inefficiencies and, frankly, overall, it weakens the Taiwan economy as opposed to strengthening it. That latter point is critical for those of us who spend time advocating on behalf of a strong U.S. relationship with Taiwan. A weak economic Taiwan is inherently not in the interests of the United States. It is inherently destabilizing for Asia, and particularly for Northeast Asia. So, what is to be done? We had the election in January of this year of a former trade negotiator. How perfect. Tsai Ing-wen. And Tsai spent a good part of her early career, particularly in the 90s, working for Lee Teng-hui, the then president of Taiwan, and she was focused on WTO accession. She's uniquely qualified to understand both what a negotiation looks like and the extent to which a a negotiation, a bilateral or multilateral negotiation, can positively impact the long-term fortunes of the country that she now leads. This is an excellent development for those of us who believe that Taiwan should be part of the TPP as it relates to the interests of our own country. Tsai, I believe, understands that it is easier domestically to undertake reform in wholesale change as opposed to addressing it incrementally. In fact, to try and deal with the different areas that Taiwan needs to do in regards to reform incrementally, she would run out of political capital probably before she's through the first two. So wholesale change that would come through a negotiation for membership in the TPP that could then be passed through the Li Fa-Yuan, Taiwan's parliament, would afford her administration and the country as a whole to undertake the most significant period of reform since the early part of the last decade, when Taiwan acceded to the WTO and undertook its obligations. Membership in the TPP, we're going to get into weeds in a wee bit, but I want to strike on a couple of things, big picture here. Membership in the TPP is critical for rebalancing cross-strait relations. We have to touch on this a wee bit because at the moment, the economic relationship between Taiwan and China is out of balance. In other words, it's creating an imbalance in Taiwan's external trade relations. It's too balanced towards China. That is a problem in respect to Taiwan's relationship with China because China does not have the same goal as Taiwan does China sees economic integration as a path towards unification. Taiwan sees it as a path towards economic improvement, or the improvement of its economic well-being. They couldn't be more different, the goals of the two sides. To provide better economic balance for Taiwan, Taiwan needs to find new markets. Taiwan needs to participate in new agreements. To do that, or to achieve that, would also afford more domestic balance in Taiwan's politics. The more politics tilt towards China, the more the domestic situation in Taiwan becomes fraught. And again, from the US standpoint, we would want to see a stable free market economy, democracy on Taiwan, one that has balanced with strong multi-party system. Right? Again, when things tilt more towards China, you get a big swing back, as we saw in January. When things tilt too far away from China, you get a big swing back, as we saw in 2008 when Ma Ying-jeou was elected. Balance. We need to return some balance. If Taiwan is excluded from the TPP, frankly, it would represent an existential threat to the country. Inside of it, as Tammy touched on in her excellent presentation, when multilateral agreements or bilateral agreements are consummated, they come at the benefit of those who agree to them, whether it's multilateral, multiple, or bilateral, just two parties. For Taiwan to be part of that, as we sort of touched on, there are politically important ramifications, and also, and we'll touch on this in more depth, economic ramifications. To be outside of it, particularly if the Koreans accede in the second round, represents a serious economic threat to Taiwan, and, as I've touched on earlier on, would undermine Taiwan's economy and thereby undermine stability and peace and security in the Taiwan Strait. So again, what I'm continuing to try and construct here for you to think about is that this isn't just an economic rationale for membership in the TPP. There is a strong one for Taiwan, but there is a geostrategic rationale every bit as important for Taiwan in respect to its membership in the TPP. And that should be of interest, both to us as a community here, think tankers, government, executive and legislative, anyway, all the communities that have an interest in the Asia Pacific. So, what does a trade agreement need to be? What a trade agreement need to be sold to TPP members as well as to its citizens? So, to approach this, Taiwan is going to need to look at two important constituencies to persuade. Right? It's going to need to persuade TPP members, and it's going to need to persuade its own citizens. So let's have a crack at those two constituencies for a second. TPP members. Well, certainly I would advocate, if Tsai Ing-wen called me up and said, "Hey Rupert, have you got a moment?" I would advocate constructing momentum around the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance starts with Taiwan's relationship with the United States and Taiwan's relationship with Japan. Those two economies are both economically, other than China, Taiwan's two most important trading partners. And additionally, they're Taiwan's two most important security partners. So Japan and the United States need to be on sides at the get-go of as Taiwan pushes towards TPP. Taiwan would then need to capture, in the middle, those economies, those countries, that on the face of it would not necessarily have an issue with Taiwan becoming a member. And I'm not going to cover them all. I'm just going to cover the three I think that Taiwan's going to have to pay special attention to. And then we're going to loop in China here. China, if you look at the way in which China has systematically undermined the ability of ASEAN to create consensus around its issues by picking off a country like Cambodia, and thereby undermining a consensus-driven approach to even a basic statement after a meeting. I think we get a picture of the sort of approach China will take if it decides to take a hard position on Taiwan's membership in TPP. And I think the countries we want to keep a close eye on are Malaysia, Peru, and Chile. The Malaysians do have a close relationship with China. They are less interested in Taiwan's fortunes than perhaps the other members are, less vested, and or in the outcome of some of the areas that China has been pushing hard in, such as the South China Sea as it might relate to Vietnam. The Chileans and the Peruvians do not have any particular interest in cross-strait relations, nor do they have any particular background. However, China is an important market for both those economies, and they are likely to be susceptible to pressure from the PRC. So we will need to keep a close eye on those three countries, and we'll need to keep a close eye on just how far the US and Japan is willing to press those three countries to come on sides, again, should Taiwan formally become part of a second round process. The other part is citizens. Tammy touched on right at the beginning our own debate here in the United States, and golly, we don't have time for that. But I would make one point about what's going on here in the US, and as you can hear from my accent, I wasn't born in Brooklyn. I think that one of the pieces that we have done a poor job of here, and also in Europe, is a constant narrative with the people of our own countries about the efficacy of trade and why it is important. And that frankly comes from the top. That really is up to our leaders. It's up to our presidents here in the United States, whoever that might be at any given time, and in Europe it's up to their leaders to constantly explain why trade is an integral part. When that doesn't happen, you allow voices on the fringes to take over the debate. And let's be clear, those voices are loud on both the left wing and the right wing of all the countries that are dealing with this. It is not a parochial issue on one side of the political spectrum or the other. The other part of this that Tsai will have, so she will have to maintain throughout her presidency, in my view, a narrative, a public narrative with her citizenry about why TPP membership and FTAs is important to her citizens. The other component of it is she's also going to have to construct with her colleagues an ongoing, robust, well thought out process for assisting in transition, economic transition for those industries that are impacted by trade. Sunset industries that are particularly impacted. That needs to be well thought through, it needs to be ongoing, and it needs to be well publicized so that people do not feel that they are not being heard. Because I think when that happens, you start to have a bigger problem. So that for her, those are I think she for her own citizenry, she's really going to have to focus on those two areas. Taiwan overall, I've read a wee bit, thanks to some of our excellent journalists who cover Taiwan issues for Taiwan Papers, represented here. I've read a wee bit about some of the other commentary that's been made in some of the sessions around town over the last few weeks on TPP. I do want to make a point. Taiwan overall has been a responsible player in the agreements that it has signed up for. WTO, it has been a responsible participant in. It has been a strong voice for continued advocacy for the body itself, as well as for initiatives within it. Yes, it is a hard negotiator, Taiwan, but it is basically on sides in a way in which we as a country would view to be positive, and therefore is a positive partner for us. That should bode well for its membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Would inviting them and having them as part of TPP be a partner with the United States for further initiatives that impact our economic welfare here? And I believe yes. It is important to distinguish that from the China agreements that lie dormant in the Parliament. Actually, they're not in the Parliament anymore. They were just pulled out because the legislation, all the legislation the Kuomintang had submitted was all pulled back, and the DPP will have to resubmit that which they feel is a priority. So we'll see if the China legislation for ECFA, for the services agreement, goes back in, as well as their version of fast track. So keep an eye on that. So just in the next couple of minutes, and then I'll wrap up, what should we look for? What should we keep an eye on, right, with Taiwan moving forward? Well, I think that there was an interesting development last week that I think speaks volumes to just how serious Lin Juan, the premier, is about moving Taiwan in a pro-reform direction. Xi Junji, who was an important advocate, spokesperson in Tsai's campaign, was given a minister without portfolio cabinet post, and in a marvelously Orwell meets Monty Python term, he was reassigned last week to head up the Taiwan Stock Exchange. I think it actually spoke more about whether or not he was pushing in the right direction for Lin Juan and his colleagues. I think perhaps not. I think that it already became clear that perhaps she was an obstacle to particularly those areas of liberalization that Lin Juan and the cabinet and Tsai Ing-wen want to head in. It also sends a message to the rest of the cabinet that while it's a robust platform for debate behind closed doors, the president and premier are in charge, and they have a vision, and they expect the cabinet to pursue it. So I think that was important. There is important focus from the president's office herself as well. And again, this loops back to this issue of how consistent will Tsai be domestically on trade liberalization and the importance of TPP. It's going to be hard for her, frankly. Our stall, I'm an incurable optimist like Tammy, so I would like also to believe that TPP will pass in our lame duck. But until we see it, it's a hope/possibility. There's no doubt that the stall has hurt Tsai, however. She wanted to come out of the gate quickly after her May 20th inauguration and start doing things that could lay the groundwork for another excellent point Tammy made about the down payment. She absolutely understands, in my view, that Taiwan has a credibility problem in a number of areas that needs to be addressed. Pork and ractopamine, golly, it almost sticks in the back of my throat, but it has to be dealt with before Taiwan will be seriously engaged by the United States on TPP, and before Taiwan can expect a statement not dissimilar to the February 2013 statement the White House released on Japan and TPP. So a down payment will be required. It's regrettable, however, that Tsai could not come straight out of the gate and make it because of the stall here domestically with our own TPP. There needs to be more clarity around that. Will the US up its game? I do think it's important for the United States to remember and to undertake its historic legacy role in supporting Taiwan and ensuring peace and security in the Taiwan Strait. I believe that the present trade mechanism that we have in place, the TIFA, is a small ball, quite frankly, and I think that our economic relationship with Taiwan is peppered with ambivalence, and that needs to change if we're going to tack in a new direction. That ball is partly in the court of Tsai Ing-wen and her colleagues, but frankly, that ball is also in the court of Mr. Obama and his colleagues at USTR, State, Commerce, and other areas of the U.S. interagency process. Final point. TPP is inherently in the interests, TPP for Taiwan is inherently in the interests of the 12 founding members of TPP, inherently, particularly the United States and Japan. Not just in dollar terms, but in the geostrategic interests of the United States. And it's beholden on all of us to keep that front and center as we push forward to some very difficult issues, but issues that can certainly be overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shihoko and the Wilson Center for inviting me here to share my thoughts about the prospects, expanding the TPP prospect for ASEAN. And I'd like to point out that I'm actually the third optimist you've invited on this panel here. So ASEAN, as you know, there are 10 countries, and of the 10 countries, 4 have already signed the TPP, and these are Brunei, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. And 3 have said that they will join in the next phase of negotiations. And these 3 are Indonesia, It's Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines. And 3 more are just not ready. And these are the least developed countries: Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, Burma. Now, so let me begin by picking up the observation that this is a hard time for the TPP in the US, and because of the anti-free trade positions taken by the presidential candidates. But we do, as Tammy said, we see the positive forward movement, the momentum. And I see this continuing at 2 levels in ASEAN, outside of the US. First of all the other 11 partners are finalizing ratification, and they're actively making preparations to implement the required domestic reforms that they have pledged to do. And so nobody's thinking that TPP will not happen. They are moving ahead on the premise that it will happen. And secondly, as I said, in addition to the 4 ASEAN members who are in the TPP, the other 3, these other 3 are they're 5 founding members of ASEAN. And these 5 members of ASEAN, which is Malaysia, Singapore, and then the other 3, Thailand, Indonesia, and Thailand, Indonesia, and Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Now, they form the most developed economies, and so they have announced that they will join. So when I looked at this, my question was, when you consider why did they not join the initial phase? Why did they wait, to do it the second phase? And my research on the political, economic, and strategic elements in the foreign policy calculations of those countries suggests that the national leaders did not initially recognize the economic advantages of the TPP membership. They appeared more concerned about the high political and social costs and the economic disruption that will happen if they were to implement the tough domestic reforms required by the TTP's 30 chapters. As Tammy said, they are the most difficult, the highest standards of the 21st century global norms for free trade. And so a cost-benefit analysis of liberalizing and deregulating the protected economic sectors, and that required, these leaders in the 3 countries to challenge powerful vested interests, rent-seeking behavior of their political and economic elites, and did not at that time seem to be worth the political pain of membership. However, what has changed their mind? First of all, I think we've got this. Sorry, so bad, but I will be in my statement. I'll tell you the important figures. The number of studies have come out, on the TPP, and the most widely cited are those prepared by Petrie, Plummer, and Tsai, Peterson Institute. So these reports, and the latest one was published in January this year, showed the impact, the benefits, and the costs, the winners and losers in the TPP. And secondly, what has actually made them resolve their political will to join is the fact that finally the TTP texts are now available. TTP negotiations were conducted in secrecy. Nobody knew what was happening. And for the first time, at the end of last year, they were published, and now everybody can see what is required. So it's clear now what they have to do. So that actually has made it, was an important catalyst in making them more determined to join. Now they know what they're going to do. So if you look at the chart here, there are 3 sectors where the winners and losers are highlighted. First one, the impact of the TPP on real income from the base year of 2015 until 2030. So in other words, in 15 years' time, what will be the gains and the losses, comparative gains and losses. The second one is on exports, and the third one is on FDI flows, FDI inflows. Now, so if we look at this, the study indicates that Vietnam will enjoy the highest gains in real income effects, 8.1% gain, followed by Malaysia, 7.6 gain in real income, Brunei 5.9, and Singapore 3.9. Now, in the category of exports, Vietnam also leads with a 30% jump in exports, followed by Malaysia with 20%, Brunei 10%, and Singapore 7.5%. And with regard to inward FDI stocks, Malaysia is projected to lead with 17.2% rise compared to Vietnam at 14.4%, Brunei 11%, and Singapore at 1.8%. So, in projecting the TPP's diversionary impact on trade, service, and FDI on Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, the study shows the following trend. For real income, Vietnam will be the biggest loser, standing at minus 0.8%, followed by Philippines and Indonesia at minus 0.1%. Thailand is also projected to in exports. Thailand's export growth will be the worst comparatively, standing at minus 1.6%, followed by Indonesia at minus 1%, Philippines at minus 0.4%. And all three countries would also experience downturns in FDI inflows, with Thailand at minus 0.2, Philippines minus 0.5, and Indonesia minus 0.8. So now, but some critics have looked at these studies and they say they're overly optimistic. And then these are the critics, as Tammy mentioned. And the one that I would like to refer to is the study done also in January this year by Kapalda, Izzarati, and Jomo Sundaram. And Jomo was a former UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development. And they base their computation on a different model. The Petri model is done on a it's done on the computable general equilibrium model. And the critics are using what they call the UN, it's called the United Nations Global Policy Model. Now, what they show is that they argue that there will be negative effects on growth in TPP's mainstay economy, US and Japan. Instead of an optimistic, they say, you're going to actually not going to have much growth, flatlined. And in fact, there'll be increasing inequality and job losses in all participating economies. It projects an overall job loss of 770,000 in all the TPP members, with the largest occurring in the US, 450,000. Now, and projections for non-TPP members are actually even worse. So China, India, and Indonesia, and other developing non-TPP members are projected to lose approximately 4.5 million jobs. And they also can expect to lose their competitive advantage and market shares. So, although we have these two different philosophical and ideological approaches to free trade, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good, but what comes out from the two studies is that they both share the common conclusion that non-TPP members are going to lose more. They'll be worse off. So the prospects of becoming less competitive and having slower economic growth compared to the ASEAN TPP nations have thus led Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia to reconsider the original misgivings. So you have, as early as September 2010, President Benigno Aquino signaled his interest to bring the Philippines in. Thailand, before she was removed by the military coup, former Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra, in 2012, said that she would like to bring Thailand to the TPP. And finally, and this was most forcefully reaffirmed by the Thai military rulers, General Prayut, Prime Minister, when he was here in DC in March this year, and he emphatically announced that Thailand will join the TPP. And finally, President Jokowi of Indonesia unexpectedly announced his interest in seeking membership during his state visit here in October last year. Another factor that was a major factor was absent from the initial calculations of the three ASEAN countries was Japan's late acceptance into the TPP negotiations in July 2013. The inclusion of the world's third largest economy and a leading trade and FDI partner of every ASEAN country, not surprisingly, raised concerns among the non-ASEAN TPP members about the negative impact of the diversion of Japanese FDI and trade to the TPP partners. And in fact, Indonesian Trade Minister Thomas Lembong said in February that he reported that Toshiba, Panasonic are thinking about reducing or even stopping the operations if Indonesia is not in the TPP. Then finally, the next key factor to consider which when we look at the economic, political, strategic calculation of TPP membership, is how membership would affect their relationship with the two most important strategic and economic partners, US and China. Although China has softened its attitude about the TPP, it has yet to fully discard its initial negative perception of the trade pact as part of a China containment policy in the Asia rebalance. However, it would appear that strategic assessment in Jakarta, Manila, and Bangkok concluded that TPP membership would strengthen bilateral strategic and economic ties to the US and Japan, with little negative costs to their economic and political ties with China. So that was the assessment they made. I'd like now to evaluate the prospects for success for each of the three countries. Now, so they all the three leaders, Duterte, well, President-elect, who will be sworn into office on Friday, Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, Prime Minister Prayut of Thailand, and President Jokowi of Indonesia, they each will have to overcome considerable economic and political challenges in accomplishing their tasks. And it also remains uncertain at this point how the TPP's benefits and losses will be distributed among the different economic sectors, and how vested interests, the rent seekers, the workers, the consumers, the NGOs would react in each of the three countries. So now, if you look at what's been happening, Manila has moved much further along than the other two countries. And in the report published by the US Chamber of Commerce on the TPP's readiness assessment for Manila, for the Philippines, they looked into 6 key chapters, competition policy, telecommunications, rules of origins. These are, they looked at them, and all the other chapters, including the tough ones. We've got the government procurement, SOEs, e-commerce, and so on. Now, the report concluded that the Philippines appears TPP ready in key respects, but membership will demand further significant adjustments in the policy and legal environments. And the report concluded by saying that probably the biggest hurdle would be constitutional provision restricting foreign ownership and participation in Philippine businesses. Now, so we look at this, and then we look at Duterte. He will be, he'll assume power next week, and he holds the key to the country's TPP membership. Should he decide that the Philippines would be better off inside rather than outside the TPP, and that the agreement would both serve his populist economic agenda and strengthen strategic ties with the US under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, he will most likely opt to continue Aquino's pro-TPP policy. The good news is that, unlike Aquino, Duterte will command the political backing to bring Philippines into TPP. He has a supermajority in Congress with the Nationalist People's Coalition and the Liberal Party. Some members have defected to join his PDP Laban-led coalition. So he has the votes to amend the constitution, and that will be done in the Philippines should he decide to do it. And also with his populist standing, he will be, I believe, he'll be able to overcome the anticipated NGO and labor opposition to the country's corporate to the country, and he'll have the corporate backing and his populist standing. He'll be able to bring the masses along with him. Thailand. If you look at Thailand, actually, General Prayut is has even stronger political control over the current political environment in Thailand. It is a military-dominated government with elections. Anytime, we don't know when elections will be held. It may be a fairly long transition period, and he'll be able to push through TPP measures through a military-dominated parliament, and he can also resort to strong-arm measures to neutralize populist opposition from NGO, consumer goods, and other anti-free trade groups that had previously opposed the US-Thai FTA initiated by former Prime Minister Thaksin before he was ousted. So Prayut would take care of that, and so I see the political will. It will happen in Thailand. Now, and Thailand, most of all, will be most affected, by as we saw in the figures. The negative impact will fall heaviest on Thailand, and it's the third largest economy in the US. It's in the middle income trap, for a long time. It has moved out of the middle income trap, and he sees the TPP, like Malaysia, as a way to move forward. So lower end manufacturing will go to Vietnam, and higher end value-added production will move to Malaysia. So I think that the domestic will is there, and the reforms, and in fact they are taking measures now, as Tammy says, doing the hard, political, addressing challenges in the economy. And so there's one. Well, before this morning, when I wrote this last night, I thought that there could be one external hurdle, and this is Congress, and that Congress may not. Because one of the procedures of TPP, you have got to accept approval. You have to approve all 12 partners, and because of the Thai military, junta, and Thailand has been under congressional scrutiny for human rights abuse. I thought perhaps Thailand Congress might make the return to democratic rule, return to democracy, a precondition for giving Thailand the green light to become the TPP. But this morning, I saw that Thailand is in Tier 3. Even the Tier 3 trafficking persons report, you are disqualified from signing any free trade deal with the U.S. Malaysia was in Tier 3. Malaysia was lifted to Tier 2 watch list, so Malaysia could sign it. And so I thought Thailand Tier 3 had a problem. But the news today said that Thailand will not be in Tier 3. Because it has done enough, to amend the abuses in the fishing, the illegal fishing industry, the abuses there. And so because of that, it no longer appears a hurdle. Now, of the three prospective members, Indonesia the hardest. Indonesia has the highest political and economic hurdles to overcome. And this is given the rise in economic protectionism in the wake of the Asia financial crisis. Jokowi's announcement to join the TPP took even his own administration officials by surprise. It is unclear whether Jokowi's fears that Indonesia will be worse off outside the TPP and hence must undertake painful economic and policy reforms. It's unclear whether these fears are equally shared by the national, regional, and local officials who would be tasked to undertake the reforms. So, and also, unlike Duterte and Prayut, who have the political leverage to bring the countries in TPP, Jokowi lacks a strong institutional political base of his own. He doesn't have control of his own party. He was a candidate chosen by Megawati of Party Democratic. So it is unclear that he will even succeed in garnering a pro-TPP parliamentary majority among the power brokers in his coalition government and the opposition. So he'll have a very, very hard time to get this through. So in short, the TPP faces an uncertain fate. As the TPP faces an uncertain fate in the US, 3 additional countries now, ASEAN countries now preparing for the second phase, actively preparing for the second phase of TPP expansion, alongside with South Korea, Taiwan, Colombia. At this time, we can only talk about the certainty of their political will, Prayut and Jokowi, and Duterte. We will know his intention later on. And then each of them will be tested by the hard realities of the required economic, political, and policy reforms, and the political dynamics, the unpredictable political dynamics that must be successfully managed for eventual ratification. As an optimist, my assumption is that the TPP will not fall apart, even if Congress fails to ratify it during the upcoming lame duck session. If elected and persuaded Hillary Clinton, on strategic and economic grounds that the TPP, buttressed by strong legislative action, Clinton will ask for legislative action to ameliorate the effects on U.S. jobs and disadvantaged sectors. She'll make sure there's a safety net for those who will be affected. And then if that can be done, she'll regain her early enthusiasm for America's secession. No, and it is imperative for ASEAN and U.S. standing of the U.S. rebalance policy that the TPP is passed, is ratified by the U.S. It will deepen ASEAN economic community, ASEAN integration. It will also help push along the ASEAN-led RCEP, the Regional Common cooperative economic partnership that is done by ASEAN, and it includes China and India, and which will be expected to be concluded by the end of the year. Now, at the same time, in order to push the TPP momentum forward for Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand, and to lay the groundwork for eventual membership for the remaining countries, Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, the next U.S. President and Congress should continue to fund resources to build a robust U.S.-ASEAN strategic partnership that was announced in Sunnylands earlier this year. And the new U.S.-ASEAN Connect initiative, those two for trade and business ties, that initiative is underpinned by 4 pillars. It's a business connect, there's an energy connect, there's an innovation connect, and a policy connect. And that US-ASEAN Connect should serve as the economic linchpin in facilitating a rules-based economic integration between the US and ASEAN and within the ASEAN countries. So this is, and if that's done, an economically dynamic ASEAN which is supportive of the high standards, 21st century global norms and rules, it will in turn significantly advance U.S. political and strategic interests in the region. So, and then without the TPP, the road ahead will be much rocky. And I just want to quickly end up by, sticking my head out and predicting who will join first, who's much easier. I think that for the countries involved, it will be, if Duterte goes ahead, it could be done. Indonesia, sorry. It's Philippines. Philippines more ready, and then you've got Thailand, and then you have Indonesia, and I think for South Korea is the first. South Korea ahead of everybody else. Taiwan will be the hardest, and as Rupert says, it is because of China will lean on the 3 TPP members who are claimant states of the South China Sea. Not only Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei. China will not let Taiwan be in TPP without China being in there. So probably will all happen when China comes in. So I don't think the ASEAN countries already have so many problems, and they want to keep their economic relationship with China. And so they probably may, I think most likely will object, will not give the green light to Taiwan membership. So 3 countries that China can work on now. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the 3 of you. Before we open the floor to questions, if I could ask a couple of questions as the moderator's prerogative. I want to pick up on what Pek-Kun said about the difficulties that Taiwan in particular faces. And there are many political hurdles to actually moving forward with TPP, but the hardest ones that Taiwan is particularly constrained because of cross-strait relations. Given that reality, will it be in Taiwan's interest to pursue more bilateral free trade agreements? And I'm thinking in particular with Japan, which is more amenable, much more amenable to Taiwan joining the TPP than the United States, for instance. And moving on that theme of bilateral free trade agreements, Korea has really been successful in having FTAs with numerous major countries, including the EU, as well as China. And indeed, after the British referendum, Korea was one of the first to say that it would want to move forward in having an FTA with Britain. Is that a possibility for Korea too? I mean, to see their plan B, can it be to pursue more FTAs? And then finally to Pek-Kun, you didn't mention RCEP. How does a lower standard free trade agreement that includes China but excludes the United States act politically for regional ASEAN centrality, so to speak? So.
Do I? I think I wouldn't. It's a great question on the bilateral over multilateral. I'd actually wager that Tsai will pursue both. And that she will continue to look for bilateral agreements, not just FTAs, but investment agreements, tax agreements. I think she's going to take an approach that really leaves no stone unturned in respect to trying to liberalize Taiwan's economy and improve market access. So yes, I would expect that process to continue. I would expect it even to ramp up I do agree that the China issue on Taiwan's accession to TPP is a real one, and again, it really comes down to who can put the most pressure on these countries to move forward. I think not to get too parochial, things with Vietnam are changing so rapidly. And the relationship between the United States and Vietnam's relationship with China is deteriorating. I want to believe that the Vietnamese are more on one side of the ledger than the other, but I absolutely agree. I was remiss in mentioning Brunei too. Yeah, Brunei and the Bruneians and the Malays are two countries to watch very, very closely.
I just want to pick up on something Rupert said about U.S. supply chains. Our high-tech supply chain runs right smack through Taiwan, and it takes time to move supply chains. So I don't want to discount that American companies are looking at this closely, notwithstanding all the challenges that have been discussed. And to the question about, Korea, Korea has FTAs with 10 of the 12 TPP partners, but there's a very important partner among the 12 they don't have an agreement with, and that would be Japan. And I would suggest that it would be, as it would be for the U.S., it would have been incredibly difficult for the U.S. to do a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan, given our earlier rocky trade history. It was much easier. What we have in TPP is an FTA with Japan. We were able to resolve decades-old, long-standing issues through TPP, both in the TPP agreement and in a parallel agreement that we did at the same time. So I would suggest that for Korea, it would be very important for them also to access the third largest economy in the world, second largest economy in Asia, the Japanese market, but it would be easier to do it through TPP.
Okay, RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, U.S. is not excluded from it. So basically, when the negotiations are expected to be concluded at the end of this year, and this will form the largest. It's a low quality, but there will be a tariff removal of tariff barriers. Non-tariff barriers are harder to accomplish, but it will appreciably push increased trade among the 10 ASEAN countries, the 6 free trade partners. So RCEP are only for the free trade partners of ASEAN. This is China, Japan, South Korea, India, New Zealand, Australia. U.S. does not want to do a free trade with ASEAN because ASEAN does not meet, there's so many problems. So because U.S. is not a free trade partner, so like the TPP, RCEP is an open, instrument, and anybody can come at a later point. Now, RCEP is good. U.S. has no problems with RCEP because any removal of barriers, any liberalization, deregulation under RCEP, under ACE is good for American business. There have been no problems. In fact, the Americans and ASEAN trade analysts, they see RCEP and TPP as being complementary. TPP for those who are ready to move, and can comply with the TPP requirements, and RCEP for those who are not ready. So we have to it's a phase, it's a sequential movement of free trade. You've got, the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community with the 10 countries. RCEP, the largest in terms of population, lower quality, but an improvement of what they have at the moment. And then finally TPP, and the expansion of TPP. So we see pathways, all these pathways to finally getting a free trade area of the Asia Pacific, FTAAP. So it's complementary. They say it's win-win, and so and what TPP is, and with 3 more countries coming to the TPP, it will move RCEP rules. So it's India, and China they have got to live up to the highest standards of RCEP because then RCEP will push for, as they make the reforms, then RCEP become a better deal. And just one thing before, I just can't resist saying this. The EU is negotiating a lot of bilaterals with the ASEAN countries because the EU-ASEAN didn't work. So, but the EU bilaterals are now in trouble with the Brexit. And so, why doesn't UK consider joining the TPP? TTIP is in trouble. TTIP is in trouble. You've got the most dynamic grain region in the world, Asia. East Asia, Southeast Asia. That's where Britain can come in.
You make a really interesting point, and one of my colleagues, as soon as the Brexit vote was announced,
Yes.
sent a note saying, let's get the UK and TPP.
Yes.
And Ambassador Froman said, interesting.
Right. That was my first reaction. TPP, then we have got,
The U.S. TPP is so important in Asia because it is about high standards and comprehensiveness, and the U.S. has, together with Japan, really driven this. And there's an opportunity here for us. But I completely agree with Pekun that RCEP is not a threat at all. American companies operating in those 16 RCEP countries, they will take advantage of that. The rising tide lifts all ships. But we do hope that it drives all standards up to help lift more people out of poverty.
All right. Thanks. So we've got 20 minutes. We have a few hands up. This is being webcast, so if you could wait for a microphone to come, that would be great. Meg.
Thank you. I'm Meg Lunsager, a public policy fellow here, previously the U.S. director at the IMF. And in the 1990s, I was the trade negotiator for Treasury, financial services, and the side agreement on exchange arrangements that Taiwan had to do to get into the WTO. So I have two questions which relate to transparency, first of all, in some countries, and then questions regarding the U.S. First of all, the finance ministries, central banks of the TPP countries negotiated a separate declaration on transparency in reporting foreign exchange reserves and intervention. Korea currently doesn't meet those standards, and Taiwan certainly doesn't currently meet those standards. To your point about taking action now, do you think those two countries are ready to be much more transparent in terms of their actions in foreign exchange markets, what their policies are, and doing that in advance as a good faith demonstration to the United States Congress that they mean to meet the standards? My second question relates to what are your members doing, sort of going around to each member of Congress, making the point that you also eloquently made here today about the benefits of trade. And Tammy, I was really struck by your point how your firms are making the effort to help those that are disadvantaged by trade. How do you get that message out? How do you get some members of Congress to be willing to step up and say, yes, trade is good for the United States of America, it's good for my district, we're helping those adversely impacted? How do we get more of that so we can change that sentiment in the United States against trade? Thank you.
Let me just unpack two of those things. Korea and their currency, are they aware of that their current actions will come under intense scrutiny should they raise their hand and say, we are ready to join TPP now? Absolutely, the government of Korea is aware of that. We talk on a regular basis. I have another hat that I wear, president of the U.S.-Korea Business Council. So I'm meeting with Korean officials on a regular basis, and currency is a real issue that needs to be addressed. What can our members on our company, what are we doing on TPP and selling it, giving members of Congress political cover? Well, we have an active and growing coalition. In fact, we met with Ambassador Froman and Barbara Weisel yesterday, I think, and went through the landscape of what our plans are during the summer recess. But I would also challenge everyone in this room. We are all U.S. citizens. If you have a U.S. passport and you're voting here, you need to be reaching out to your member of Congress and telling them trade is important. It's ironic that both presumptive candidates are attacking trade so vehemently. And I would argue that the presidential rhetoric on trade is a fact-free zone. They are not speaking with facts. We cannot let Americans be driven down a path where people are using misinformation, just wrong-headed information. We've got to get the facts out there. So I challenge us all. I will tell you that yesterday during the Republican presumptive nominee's speech, one of my colleagues was tweeting like mad. I was in the next room going, oh my goodness, and he was over there tweeting. Okay, he was smarter than me yesterday. I will be tweeting today. day. But we all need to be tweeting, and we need to get our messages out there. If we fail here, the damage will be cataclysmic for the United States. And I'm not just talking about trade, I'm talking about leadership in Asia and around the world. And to those candidates or folks who are members of Congress who say, oh, we can pick it up next year or the year after, it's fine. I've actually been to most of the rounds in the last 5 years. I talk to our trade partners every day. No one is going to want to do business with the United States if we walk away from this agreement that we pushed everyone for. Remember I said 80 to 90% of all those hard things in there we asked for, and then we're going to cut off our trade partners' legs? That would be the most irresponsible thing America could do, and I, for one, am not going to let that happen. I'll stop now.
That's fantastic. Just a couple of quick things on the question that you asked. To me, it really is about leadership. Yes, we can talk. To me, it really starts with presidential leadership. It really starts with presidential leadership on trade, and that's or head of state leadership. And that's a question for all of us to think, well, how good a job has our president done on that front? How fertile a ground has been created to date for those who are dissenting, and what can be done about it? Leadership. So I want to strike that. It's not too late to advocate loudly. From a more parochial standpoint, the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council has a working group of members. Tammy mentioned the supply chain. On the supply chain, and on exactly the point actually that Tammy made, we've been going around talking to those legislators whose constituencies host these companies, or these companies are based in, to explain to them just how dramatic and traumatic it would be to uproot the supply chain if Taiwan is not part of the TPP. So those stakes are being made. On the most parochial of the issues, the one that you raised initially, I don't see that being an issue that Taiwan would do unilaterally as a down payment, quite frankly, only because I've never heard of it being a priority issue in any of the meetings or delegations or senior U.S. government officials that travel to Taiwan prioritizing that. It's typically pork. Agricultural issues are the ones that really play most strongly with Taiwan. I must say, though, that it's not to say that issue will not be addressed. If Taiwan wants to accede, it will have to be. But directly with your question, will it be a down payment? I would doubt it.
All right. Gentleman here.
Pardon me, my throat's gotten a bit dry listening to you. Ms. Overby, please. How do you counter the argument that because the U.S. is setting 90% of the trade rules that you mentioned, that these are highly beneficial trade rules for United States industry and will disadvantage industries in the Asian countries, especially small industries?
We believe that fair trade and high standard rules and a comprehensive agreement benefits everyone. Yes, the U.S. will benefit, but if one looks at why South Korea has been on a tear for the last decade negotiating free trade agreements around the world, it's because they see that it benefits their companies and their citizens, their workers, their employees. So we think, will it help America? Absolutely. But will it equally help the partners, the countries and economies that sign on? We think it will.
This is directed to Mr. Hammond Chambers, but feel free to weigh in. So as a student who's been taking Chinese, studied in China a few times, and has teachers of Taiwanese and Chinese descent, you mentioned how the economic and political balance is tilted towards China right now between Taiwan and the mainland. But how will Taiwan's joining of the TPP kind of already affect our complex relationship with the mainland and Taiwan, and especially what's going on in the South China Sea right now? Will this kind of create more of a, fuel China's us against the world, David and Goliath story, that they can play on. Not that I'm saying that, Taiwan shouldn't be strong, but what is the collateral of, a stronger Taiwan in the agreement?
Yeah, thank you. China would certainly hope that we think that, for sure. They're counting on it, in fact. They're counting on us calibrating that the pain in bilateral relations with them will disincentivize us to maintain a robust relationship with Taiwan. I really would flip it around and say, what is in the U.S. interest? Do we want China green lighting and red lighting who can be in the TPP and who can't be? That doesn't sound like sovereignty to me. That doesn't sound like the United States acting in its own interest. It sounds like the U.S. abdicating its interests in respect to China's interests. So I think there's a fundamental issue here about who within the TPP is in charge, and the extent to which China can influence membership in the TPP, whether Taiwan or some other member that China may find objectionable. Certainly Taiwan is the tip of that. And I would just like to reiterate the point I made early on in my formal remarks about the importance of balance, and to look at that through several different prisms, as well but one of which is the economic balance and the extent to which the perception that the economic relationship with China has created a tilt with Taiwan and its external relations, and what that means for Taiwan voters and Taiwan people in respect to their view about self-determination and how that impacts the choices they make. Because instability can start domestically on the island and then translate through its democratic process into policies that may then draw us and others into a higher tension environment. So again, my own view, I hope persuasive, is that the United States acting in its own self-interest, which is always fundamentally peace and security in the Taiwan Strait, and Taiwan membership in the TPP is an important part of an overall policy that the US should pursue to maintain security in Northeast Asia and ensure that, importantly, I believe, the Chinese do not have a green light or a red light in areas of interest where they're not members. So I think there's a fundamental issue.
I'd also like to address the issue of China. China's view on TPP, I think, has noticeably changed. The Chinese went from really viewing it with suspicion, being concerned that it might have at its fundamental root a desire to contain China. I know my conversations with Chinese officials, and I'm meeting with them on a regular basis, is that nothing could be farthest from the truth. Again, 50 years ago, or 50 years from now, when we look back on TPP, if China is not an active, supportive member, we've failed. TPP was always designed to be an organic agreement so that economies, when they were ready and able to meet the high standards, could dock in, could join. And we very much want and hope China will at the earliest convenience, whenever they think it's in their national interests. I think TPP now, that we were in APEC in Bali 3 years ago, and Commerce Minister Gao said, China will join TPP in 3 to 5 years. I nearly spewed out my coffee. That was the first time I heard a senior Chinese official speak so declaratively about it. The timing we may have a question about, but I think China realized, in fact, we have a track 2 dialogue, CEOs of Chinese, mostly state-owned officials with our CEOs, and then we have retired former officials. We do that because in China, they can get off the party line much faster and we can have a really constructive engagement. A couple of years ago, we commissioned the Peterson Institute to do a study on a U.S.-China FTA. What would a roadmap look like, knowing it's not immediately on the horizon? Our Chinese partners did a different study. They looked at TPP plus Japan minus China. And what they realized is the trade diversion that has been discussed. We had our most recent Track 2 discussion. The Chinese were here a couple of weeks ago, and it was fascinating to hear Chinese CEOs talking about relocating manufacturing from Guangdong into Vietnam, because Vietnam is a TPP player. So I think the landscape is changing, and countries around Asia and economies around Asia will see opportunities for growth. We all want the same things. And I strongly echo that peace and security, the more trade crosses borders, the less armies do. We've had U.S. troops in South Korea since the Korean War. Technically, they stopped the cessation of fighting in 1953. And during that time, South Korea went from one of the poorest economies to today 13th or 14th largest economy in the world, depending on whose numbers you're looking at. A leader in ships, steel, semiconductors, autos. How did they do that? With trade. Trade is good, and we need more.
So I just want to maybe pick up something that the last gentleman, the answer, is that, the U.S. thinks that the U.S. got the worst, the wrong end of the stick in the TPP negotiations, although they set up to about 80% of the norms. In ASEAN, the feeling is that the U.S. have gotten the best deal. They feel that this will really benefit American corporate interests. I mean, there'll be rising inequality. All free trade does that. But I think there's a lot of resistance, it took such a long time, the torturous negotiations. But ultimately, Vietnam, Malaysia came in because of the long phase-in periods. They're up to about 20 years. There's phase-in periods, there's thresholds. They have autonomy over national policy. And so and also in the case of China, when they negotiated the SOE chapter, they were thinking about Chinese membership later on.
Absolutely.
And make it possible for China to come in. And also in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, the Chinese began talking about the TPP in a more positive way. 3-4 years ago, they started. So the feeling in ASEAN is that China will ultimately join the TPP.
She makes a really excellent point. TPP is the only trade agreement in existence that has it was designed for developing countries and developed economies, but with one high standard. So that everybody, Vietnam, Malaysia, they agreed to that single high standard, but they don't have to do everything on day one. Yeah. There are long phase-ins, there are transition periods, there's technical assistance, there's capacity building. Right now, we have USAID officials in Vietnam working with the Vietnamese officials, learning about these high standards. How do you write the regulations for that? Mm-hmm. How do you write those new laws? So I think the leaders of Vietnam are courageous and visionary because they're using TPP to modernize their economy and to ensure future competitiveness. And everybody in that neighborhood who's not part of TPP, they're very nervous and they're wondering, how do we get there? So I think the period of U.S. bilateral FTAs in Asia is probably over. It is now about pathway to TPP. How do we lift everyone up?
Can I just loop back to China and Taiwan for a second? It is encouraging to hear that the Chinese may at some point accede to the TPP, but Taiwan's candidacy should not be hooked to that. Taiwan should have a different path from China's. So perhaps there are positive fortunes for China. That's fine, but the WTO model is not applicable here. Thank you.
We have time for one last question, Rui.
Hello, thank you for your comments this morning. I have a question related to South Korea and Taiwan. Youth employment has been a big issue for leaders in both economies. My question is, should issues related to economically vulnerable demographics play a more prominent role in ratification or inclusion considerations? Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's going to happen here. people, economies, companies that are hurt by trade, everyone around the world needs to do more for them. And the income gaps that are created by trade, we all have to do more to help people transition. The fact that Uber is the largest taxi company in the world but doesn't own a taxi. Airbnb, largest hotel in the world, doesn't own a room. Amazon, largest shop in the world, doesn't own, they don't own. The models are changing. And this disruption of technology, trade can help that. What TPP will do is it will really energize and allow the internet. So SMEs in these 12 countries will be able to, if you're a Vietnamese exporter and you only export to one country, suddenly you can export to Japan, Canada, the US, Mexico, same rules. The harmonization that's in there is critical. But your point about helping those that are hurt, that's going to have to be part of everybody's new discussion. When whether it's Brexit, whether it's TPP, people around the world are unhappy, and they're not going to take it anymore. But they are going to support TPP in America.
For me, that's more of a domestic political issue, and that's about structural reform within economies, and a preference for maintaining employment for those who are older at the expense for those who are younger, and that's typically about domestic governments having the wherewithal to tackle local and parochial interests and reforming economies. So perhaps there's a role. The TPP and trade agreements create more growth and more opportunity. That's the way I see it. They create more demand for whatever an economy can produce. How to create more and better upward mobility for young people and more job opportunities, to me, is more of a domestic issue, and the extent to which an employment market is appropriately deregulated and young people can compete for jobs.
The labor inflexibility in Korea, it is still extremely difficult and costly to adjust your workforce. And because of that, no one wants to hire anybody, because if you hire them, you've basically hired them for life. So 15-20% youth unemployment, that's unsustainable. I would agree with Rupert, it is a domestic issue.
You just look at structural unemployment around the world, Western Europe, and in Asia, and as Tammy and I seem to be on the same page with, where you see high youth unemployment, typically you have rigid labor markets and the inability of companies to hire and fire, and that hurts the young people more than it hurts anybody else.
The youth demographics in ASEAN is even more significant. 60% of the population in ASEAN is under 30. Much, much larger youth, and they're all, social networkers. They use one of the biggest Facebook users. So the TPP's e-commerce and digital trade, the new models, that will really is huge. So ASEAN understands it has got to move into the new lines of commerce, and that's why there's so much political will now, to join the TPP.
All right. Okay, well, the time has come. We have a slogan, trade is good. But before we part, go our separate ways, I want to go on the record and say that our three speakers have agreed to submit papers. And so we will have a publication based on this event at a later date. Stay tuned. So thank you all very much for coming, and hope to see you at another event soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Listen, if we didn't have a sense of humor, what we do.
That's right.